This is the All Rev'd Up podcast, and I'm Reverend Emmett Price.
And I'm Reverend Irene Monroe.
Irene, before we jump into a conversation on where do we go from here, invoking the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we need to thank each and every one of our listeners. Thank you for your support, for your encouragement, for your feedback, and for your comments, especially on our episode on voter suppression, which got us on national TV.
A tsunami of thanks for that. I was so surprised and just absolutely excited. But you know what that means, Emmett? That this was an important issue considering, the state of America.
Yeah. And of course, huge shout outs and much gratitude to our amazing producers, Kyla Wright and Cavante Smalls.
Listen, when you talk about those two, you're talking about the creative genius of what makes this wheel roll.
Here, and I agree. Irene, today's episode is about Black agency and the hopes, dreams, and desires for the season ahead.
That's right.
This is not about the outcome of the most divisive election cycle in our lifetimes. Although we are recording this prior to the end of the election, our focus is on us,
That's right.
Black folks.
hmm
Where do we go
From
from
here.
here?
Amen. That's right.
So, what would you say? Where do we go? What do we do?
Well, you know what, you pretty much, it's so interesting. It's the same old, same old. It really doesn't matter who gets elected because we have to face some of the same political, economic, social, and moral issues that we've been facing since we've come to these shores. I mean, the promise has been broken.
Mhm.
Okay, 40 acres and a mule here. So the thing that we're really looking at, and when we are saying where do we go from here, we're talking about how do we collectively move forward and take care of ourselves, because it's really when we ask where do we come from, where do we go from here, we're really signifying a call for action, because there's something deeply broken in the body politic and this experiment called democracy that has just never worked for us. You know what it does? It reminds me of a lecture James Baldwin had in 1965 at Oxford with
Mhm.
William F. Buckley. And he said this: is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? And
Mm.
that was a question. And then he turned it into a declarative statement. And he says that the American dream is very much at the expense of the American Negro. So we have been really at the expense of this American dream. We're still dealing. It doesn't matter who wins the election. We still will deal with homelessness, mass incarceration, unemployment, underemployment. We're dying disproportionately before COVID hit us because of health disparities. And also, we're still trying to seek justice for Breonna, for George Floyd. I mean, let's go way back. Eric Gardner,
Mhm.
Tamir. I mean, so the point is that we can't wait for a government that has failed us continuously to not do for ourselves.
Well, I'm going to mess with you a little bit because when the question is, where do we go from here? You framed where we've come from and what we've been through. And I think part of the challenge is that we can't prescribe the right medicine if we don't correctly diagnose the problem. And so I want to invoke our sister Isabel Wilkerson here, who
hmm
has helped us to really look at a conflation of issues. We know about the impact of white supremacy and the notion of how white supremacist ideologues use racism, particularly anti-black racism. But Isabel Wilkerson gives us this notion of caste and
hmm
how there's a caste system underlying or perhaps even working within the racist system. So when we look at that, then our reality is in order to move forward, we need to decide who we are and define that. And then we also need to understand that our economic power needs to be spent specifically in ways and shapes where it comes back to the neighborhoods and the communities where we live. And so
But
that
that's
notion of
hard though,
mobility.
Emmett. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
hard. That's hard. So let's talk about Isabel for a second here. So when she talks about caste, she's talking about the structure. And
Hmm.
when and then when she talks about race, she talks about the skin that is
Hmm.
very much on the structure. So what makes us in this particular class easily identified is because of our skin color. But she appropriates that caste system actually from India. And the interesting thing about it, she actually goes back to Martin Luther King because he made a trip to India. And when he was being introduced as one of someone from a much lower class, the
Hmm.
untouchables,
Hmm.
and at that time that I think are called something quite different now. So the point is that it seems like that's the thing that we have not really sort of excavated clearly enough. So where do we go from now? I wanted to offer first what was promised to us and what we're still dealing with. But
Hmm.
we have to now define what do we want in face of what we have known for centuries.
Yeah. And so from the framework that I'm working from, I'm not waiting for the folks who are promising us something in order for them to make good of it. Because, when folks show you who they are, you need to believe them. And so
Mhm.
I think that we have equal power
An agency.
and agency to be self-determined and to rise up in a way where we don't need nobody's permission and we don't need to wait on anybody's invitation, because we are equal participants in this democracy and we are equal citizens in this nation. So,
But the
as much as I
opportunities
would,
are not equal though. See, that's
and
the
that's
point.
the issue.
See,
That's
because
the issue.
like we're the last hired,
In the
you
first
know,
fired.
that's right.
Yeah.
And or promoted. And so one of the things that we have to realize that the intentionality of how white supremacy works and structural racism works was that with the whole idea of integrating us was that out really disempowered us economically. It was intentionally because again, how many black businesses do we have here in the state of Massachusetts, let alone across the country? So it's so funny that when we look at something, when we talk about the Green Book, not the movie, the
Hmm.
actual lived reality, I
Hmm.
tell people, as one who had to use the Green Book to go south, is that black people own gas stations, and folks look at me like, say, what? Other than just beauty parlors and barbershops, but actually own motels and hotels, and they look at, and not a boarding house. I'm talking about motels and hotels. So a lot of that black entrepreneurship got lost with the intentionality of how integration was rolled out. At the same time, how Brown versus Board of Education was intentionally not to succeed, and also how affirmative action was intentionally not to succeed for
So
us.
let me back up just for a second, because you invoked the Green Book. For those of our listeners and viewers who are not familiar with the Green Book, it literally was a published book that told you where all the black businesses in a certain area, certain region, certain state, certain city were. So that as you were traveling, particularly traveling in different places in the South, or as Irene would say, in the up South,
Up
you
south
knew
here, that's
you knew
right.
what was safe. You knew where you could actually leverage your dollars. And if you didn't have enough money for a meal, you knew where you can go and actually find somebody who would have mercy upon you and feed you because you needed to eat. And
That's
so,
right.
in that sense of a green book, I wonder if it makes sense for a 21st century green book for
Maybe
us to actually
okay.
know where our black businesses are so that we can support them, so that we can actually maybe even refuel into our black HBCUs, right? Our historically
Mm-hmm.
black colleges and universities. And in this way, we can, take a look at how black churches used to buy, real estate in order to set up, properties
And
for
housing
and
and
housing
housing
for black
and
people.
stuff. But I think I like that idea for a couple of reasons now because of the internet. And this is a sign for us being, in lockdown because of COVID, is that we can now dwarf those distances. Many of us do shop online. So
Hmm.
now I can shop for and support a black bookstore,
Hmm.
and I can actually go and support a Black boutique that might be in Detroit, even though I'm here,
Mhm.
in Cambridge here. Because one of the things that bothered me reading the economic third quarter, the government, Trump said, we went up by 7.3%, but the recovery, whatever, if you want to call that a recovery, did not impact Black people, particularly African American women who had to, either give up their jobs because of they don't have childcare and they can't send their kids to school, or Latinx folks who live intergenerationally. So, and then the audacity, if you remember, Kushner saying that, if African Americans are still struggling under Trump, it's because we're not working hard enough. Sort of evoking that racial trope that we're lazy, but more importantly, what Reagan evoked when he came up with this notion of welfare queen. So you're absolutely right. We have to begin to think about how to generate that model and be expansive with it across the state.
I mean, what would happen? Let's just imagine with me. Imagine with me. What would happen if Black folks took ownership of our educational system? What
Mm,
would happen if Black folks took ownership of our healthcare system? What would happen if Black folks took care of our housing opportunities? What would happen if Black folks took agency of our employment and our job opportunities? What would happen if we actually figured out a way to develop an economic wealth system so that we won't talk about a wealth gap, but we
that's
will
right.
talk about wealth mobility and social mobility by giving folks access to the information. We don't need
Absolutely.
handouts. We
Well,
don't
we never
need,
been asking
yeah,
for one here. And the thing about it is that at this point, we actually can do that. We have a critical mass of Black educators because, listen, we've been miseducated, to be quite honest here.
we
And
have,
so,
we,
so that's one. And then we have a critical mass of physicians. So we really have the capability of doing it. We need the creative genius of someone mapping it out how it can work. And listen to this about healthcare. Now that we're doing telemedicine, listen, who are the Black doctors? We can do that. That is becoming a new paradigm to really, dwarf the gap in terms of reaching out to people of color.
well, folks, if you're listening here, if you're viewing us, let us know what you think. Let us know what you're feeling. Give us some interaction so that we can, continue this conversation dialogue with you. Irene, you came up with this question, and it was stimulated by Dr. King, who asked this question in a number of speeches, and particularly in his last book that he wrote, "Where Do We Go From Here?
That's right.
Chaos or
Or
Community?"
community.
But you talk about a redux. What do you mean by
Well,
redux?
the redux is that, I always say that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Because when we open up this segment, I said that, King is talking about in 1967. Let's give some context here. A red hot summer, a summer of riots. It was about 139 riots across the country. This is 1967. But
Hmm.
one of the things you would remember, well, you weren't even born here, but it was 159 riots. I want to say it was 100. It was called the long hot summer of 1967. It was 159 riots across the country in 1967. Now, watch yourself when I say this, Emmett. So in 1965, and yes, I know you were not born, but I was here. Okay, I was here, and but the point was riot. The Watts riot. I'm sure your parents have told you about that incident. So the point is that King was asking the questions that we ask today about homelessness, mass incarceration, unemployment, underemployment, health disparities. That's why I say the more things change, the more they remain the same, which is why I like your idea. We need to pull our strength.
Well, Irene just told everybody how old I am. If you didn't get the cues, if you didn't see the spilled tea on the table, go back and listen to that clip again. It's a moment where we need to take a break. So we'll be right back. This is the All Rev'd Up podcast.
I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here. One day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged place. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring.
This is the All Rev'd Up podcast. The voice that you just heard was that of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he gave his address at the 10th annual session of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in August of 1967 there in Atlanta, Georgia. That address was very lengthy. In fact, the address would stimulate a series of essays that he published in 1967 after taking some time away in Jamaica, of all places, uh, to to hide out a little bit so he can get some writing done. I need to try that. And that book was
Both
Where
do.
Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?
Yeah. Yeah.
Irene, what do you think? What do you
Well,
think?
it's really interesting in many ways because one of the things he's talking about is really restructuring and deconstructing that sort of caste system that Isabel Wilkinson talks about. And you begin to wonder because begin to wonder what happened between 1963, because that march was the March on Washington for
Mhm.
Jobs and Freedom, and what happened between that moment and 1967 when he's given the sermon, which becomes the blueprint for the book. I become sad when I think about that book because that's the last book he wrote,
Mhm.
because in less than a year he's assassinated. And so one of the things that and I'm so glad he leaves us a blueprint here, because he's talking about the way in which capitalism, he talks about it in white supremacy and patriarchy, in many ways break our sense of collective care, because he's asking the question, why are 40 million people living in poverty? That number has grown exponentially from the time that he asked that question to where we are now. So when he's talking about this sort of what I see as collective care for every citizen in America, he's saying that there has to be a purpose-driven, mantra of how we do that. I mean, we have to be trauma informed. And I think what happens with many of us, we're so trauma informed, we're reactionary to the kind of work that has to be done. And we have to be healing engaged as well as ourselves, but in terms of healing this very much broken system. And that we have to be spiritually grounded, which I've always appreciate that. And with him, we begin to understand why spirituality always mattered, and be community held. And I think he gives us that blueprint, not only in the book, each of the chapters, but certainly in that speech here. And one of the examples that we're seeing this being done is with Black Lives Matter.
I totally agree with what you said. I think your analysis of his speech and his text is right. And I think one of the pieces that, I remember the Million Man March. I remember some of the mobilization during the height of the hip hop movement in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And there was always this economic development piece and the notion of how do we leverage our financial resources and how do we think about wealth, how do we think about assets, how do we think about ownership. And I think that that's a piece that we need to really reclaim, because the reality is Black folks are exhausted. We're exhausted in our daily lives. We suffer from anxiety because we're not white, and we suffer from stress because we're not being seen as American.
Right.
And yet we built this nation. And I
Right.
almost want to say we built this nation on our backs, but I'm listening to what Dr. King said. Dr. King says, straighten out your backs, straighten up your backs, because a man who a man or a woman can only ride on your back if it's bent.
That's right. That's right. And so, it gets back to that earlier question. Is America at the expense of the Negro, or do we say declaratively, America is very much at the expense of the American Negro? This is what Baldwin says here. And I think this here, as I said, we have a critical mass. And even before we had a critical mass, redlining has always existed, but we had banks.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Churches, come on, Emmett, you work with me on this. Churches have loan systems. I mean,
Mhm.
so there's a way that's where I says that we have to have a engage healing that where it's communally held, where we understand that we all have to work together, and it has to really be grounded spiritually because it's the substance that propels us forward. King, showed that with the movement, SCLC, and with the march.
Mhm. And the thing that King really talks about, both in his speech, but really in his writing, is this presence of hope. And in my 2020 articulation, our hope has to be stronger than our fear. And we have precedent. We have precedent. We can go whether you want to go to Harlem or you want to go to Oklahoma, right? You had black wealth within the old school Harlem, back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. You had Black Wall Street. Next year in
But that was
2021, we're going to celebrate or commemorate. There's no
the
celebration.
centennial of the
The
of the
centennial of
massacre
the massacre.
of
But
the
before the
massacre.
massacre, there was black wealth. There was
Yeah.
Black Wall Street before the massacre. All the focus on the massacre kills the vitality of what's existed before that.
Mm-hmm,
And so we
mm-hmm.
had precedent. We've done it before. We have been as Damon John and those folks who had the clothing line. We have been for us by us, FUBU, for a
Mm-hmm.
long time now.
Yeah, and we continue to be so. I
Yeah.
mean, even when we look at the hip hop moguls here, listen, a lot of those boys didn't go to Harvard Law School, but they have a genius entrepreneurial mind. And
Hmm.
one of the things that we got to realize, the society is not going to do it for us.
That's
We can
correct.
demand it, and it doesn't matter how much we demand it, no matter how much we knock on the door, no much. It doesn't matter that the fact that we play by their game. It is not designed for us to succeed. Now, our ancestors knew that. Wall Street, Black Wall Street understood that. All the folks, during the Jim Crow era, who made a way out of no way, understood that. And I think that we got to understand that these promises that politicians make, to get our vote, but not our concerns, have nothing to do with us once they win.
So here's what we got to do. We have to realize that the ideology of white supremacy is our greatest enemy. And we need to realize that their fear of the browning of America is the challenge, right? It's their fear, it's not ours. King talked about this.
That's
He
right.
talked about the white backlash, right? As black folks started to do good and we started to accumulate things, that there was a white backlash. We're experiencing right now the white backlash as you have folks who are murdering black people even after George Floyd and even after all of these pontifications of
And inflection moments,
inflection moments and
moments, and
kumbaya statements. Yeah.
tokenism, because you noticed with George Floyd, they've used every black person has either been nominated for an award or given a little extra money. But the point here is this here. We if we don't do it, nobody else will do
That's
it.
it.
And to get back to your point of the browning of America, Emmett, I would say this, that the backlash has always been ever since we've shown agency, whether that was a slave revolt or
Yeah.
whether that is Black Lives Matter. King was the most hated and dangerous man in America.
Yeah.
And what they do is you got to realize that they kill folks, they kill us, they find various ways to kill us. We need not to, really be complicit or collude in their effort to get rid of us.
So we need to focus on the transition from survival to thriving.
Yeah.
We need to have a vision that is grounded in hope and I would
Praxis
articulate
too.
in faith,
And
but
praxis.
and praxis, but
Yeah.
a vision towards thriving. So what does it look like for us to be successful? And Irene, you talked about being spiritually grounded as a piece of it. And so as we close today, I want to share as way of a benediction, an excerpt of a piece that I wrote a few years back in 2012. It was entitled "To Serve the Present Age, a Benediction," and it comes from a book that I edited called "The Black Church and Hip Hop Culture
All
Towards
right.
Bridging Generational Divide."
All right.
Help us, O Lord, to heed the words of your servant Isabella Baumfree. who challenged the church to not be so religious that we are no earthly good. Help us, dear Lord, to spread love, not hate, to seek your peace, not our war. Help us, O Lord, to nurture and develop our youth and not neglect and destroy them. Help us, dear Lord, to restore dignity, pride, honor, and the pursuit of righteousness in the hearts and minds of all of your children across the globe and beyond, so that we will emerge blameless, courageous, and ready to receive your healing and reconciliation. Help us, O Lord, to understand the power of freedom and to realize that power in our local, regional, national, and global communities. Help us, dear Lord, to be more vigilant toward the needs, concerns, and desires of all generations, so that we will not repeat the errors of our collective past. In the memory of all the saints who dreamed of tomorrow's hope and lived for today's faith, we ask you to restore the justice, equality, liberty, and peace across the world and beyond. That same justice, equality, liberty, and peace that you once prepared in a garden called Eden. This is our prayer for the present age. Amen.
Amen.
And Ashe.
Ashe.
All Rev'd Up is brought to you by us, the Revs. Our amazing producers are Kyla Wright and Cavante Smalls.
Music for this episode is brought to you by Reverend Price's son, musical prodigy Emmett G. Price IV. All Rev'd Up is distributed by GBH.
Additional thanks to Bob Kempf, Nina Perzuki, Chelsea Mers, Meredith Neerman, and Zach Waldman.
If you like what you hear, let us know. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts and follow us at All Rev'd Up Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
Feel free to send us a note, a question, or a comment to allrev'duppod@gmail.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of All Rev'd Up.